Okay, well, thank you. If you've just joined, welcome. Welcome to our first strategy activation webinar. I'm Eric Wood, and I'd love to invite you, if you haven't already, to type into the chat box down the bottom right of your screen, just where you're calling in from. It's very cool to see what a diverse group we've got from all around the world. Very exciting stuff. Let me just introduce what we're going to be doing first, and then we'll actually head into the content. For those of you that don't know XPLANE, we are a design consultancy. We were founded about 25 years ago in St. Louis, Missouri. We now are headquartered in Portland, Oregon, and we're focused on designing change and activating change within organizations. That's really the bulk of our business. We work with about a quarter of the Fortune 500, as well as lots of NGOs and nonprofits. So we have experience doing what we're talking about today. To kind of get a picture of where we fit in the world, we really see ourselves sitting at the intersection of strategy, design, and culture. And the reason that I think that's important is for those of us that are in the strategy execution space or the strategies planning space, we all know that organizations ultimately are made up of people. And that makes them organisms in a way. And so really finding that sweet spot between how you use design thinking and visual thinking tools as a technology to activate strategy among people is really the core of what we do. And that's going to be a key theme for today in terms of what we'd like to share in terms of what we've learned over the past years. To give you just a really brief update on who I am and where I've come from. I have a classic strategy background. I received my MBA from Harvard Business School and then went on to work at Bain & Company as a strategy consultant, both in their Chicago and San Francisco offices. And had the pleasure of designing strategy and working with large organizations around the world to help put together strong strategies. I've also had the opportunity to work on the other side of that equation, which is actually executing strategy. So I've worked in large organizations like Intuit. I've worked with medium-sized organizations in Silicon Valley in the .com space and internet companies. And I've worked within small businesses, including my own entrepreneurial ventures, as well as serving on boards of nonprofits. So we've had the benefit from my point of view of being able to understand both sides, how to design strategy, and then the struggles that it takes to actually bring it to life at organizations large and small. Hopefully that'll give me some empathy for a lot of the different roles that you're coming from and understanding what it takes to bring this to life. And right before we dive into this, if you're online tracking things, just want to highlight that you can follow this conversation on Twitter on #StrategyActivation. And if you haven't already connected with us via our newsletter, we'd invite you to text to the number here on the screen to start receiving our monthly newsletter in which we highlight new tools that are coming out, new points of view, new strategy. So first, let's dive in. I'd like to set the table by just kind of hearing from the group why you're here. What is your biggest question today? And that'll help me reframe some of my thinking as we go through the conversation. If you wouldn't mind, if you've got a burning question that you really want to get answered in this session today, type it in the chat box, and I'm just going to quickly collect those themes, and then we'll make sure that we address most of those topics. So let me give you 1 minute to do that. Let's see what some of your questions are. Any big questions from the crowd that we want to address? Let's see, we're getting a bunch of them here. Business unit understands how they ladder to corporate strategy. Great, we'll talk about that. How to move the skepticals in a culture change. That is unfortunately a big number in the organization, and we're going to talk directly to that. Part of a nascent organization without strategy, looking for ways to socialize and align around the value of strategy. Great, okay. There is a lot of skepticism sometimes. We definitely want to be talking about that. How to lead strategy when you're not the executive. So leading within, that's a big conversation right now. Organizations are less and less hierarchical. So how do we actually start to influence strategy from all levels of the organization? Great. Okay, there's so much good stuff here. So, and I'll continue to review these as we go and keep them coming. I'd love to hear them, but I think we'll be able to address a lot of these key questions that you've got. So let's dive in. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about the problem. Why is it we're probably all on this webinar today? As a former strategy consultant, I got really frustrated with this reality, which is organizations spend a lot of money on strategy. Almost $38 billion are the measured numbers last year in terms of the dollars spent just hiring strategy consulting firms to do strategy consulting. This doesn't include process, this doesn't include culture, this doesn't include change. This is purely strategy consulting. And if you add up the numbers of resources that get spent in the organization around planning and executing and reworking, it's a huge expense, huge multiple of that. And unfortunately, what we have learned is that 80% plus or minus 10, depending on who you talk to, of those strategies are going to fail. That is a huge waste of resources investments. And unfortunately, it is keeping organizations from moving forward and advancing and growing as quickly as possible. So my goal is very simple. We want to figure out what are sort of the magic elements and concepts that are going to allow you to be part of that 20% of the organizations that succeed. What have we learned in our years of doing this work that informs where people make mistakes, how to avoid them, and what are the tools and techniques that can be applied so that we can actually bring those strategies to life in an organization? We'll start by looking at kind of the perspective that we've got. As strategy planners, oftentimes what we see is pretty clear. That's where we're headed. That's the destination. Let's all get there and go there. Unfortunately, what we know from talking to people in organizations, especially, is that unfortunately, this is more like what they see. Oftentimes, it's a muddy view. That view of the summit is not clear. The vision of where we're going is not obvious. If you can see the mountain you're headed to in the first place, you also see all the obstacles before you. There'll be dragons there. There's a lot of obstacles that you need to navigate to get there. And frankly, for most people in organizations, that feels like risk. That feels scary to people. And so we need to overcome that apathy, that risk, that understanding of what's in it for me to get people to even embark on the journey, let alone to actually start executing in alignment to get where they need to go. We know in our 25 years of working with our clients that there are really three key reasons that we continue to hear about why it is that organizations are experiencing this strategy failure rate. The first one that we want to talk about is one that is really directly related to the employee. The fact that there isn't that line of sight, that clear vision of what you see and what they need to see. So understanding as an employee, where are we headed? How are we going to get there? Why are we making this change? What's in it for me? Why should I make this change? And then ultimately, what's my role in this? And how do I ladder up to that entire strategy, to use the words of one of our participants? That line of sight is a critical and fundamental need that amazingly continues to be overlooked even to this day. The second thing that we've observed is that organizations spend money and resources and time developing strategy, but they spend very little of the same resources actually trying to mindfully activate that strategy. So this looks a lot like something I'm sure we've seen. It looks a lot like that thing where the strategy gets developed at an offsite and turned into a 3-ring binder and maybe presented at a PowerPoint presentation town hall to the entire organization. And then we sort of wish it good luck and hope that it's going to come to life, but we don't invest in the continuous education and enlightenment around that strategy. And that just doesn't work. We know that that is actually doomed to failure. And then lastly, the lack of employee engagement is a factor that we see quite often, particularly as one of our participants highlighted, as organizations are shifting and changing in terms of being less hierarchical. We see more and more employees that are more empowered, they're in better positions of decision making, but yet if we don't engage them both in the process and then engage them in an engaging way in the activation, they're less likely to be supportive of the change. So we need to think about activation as we go through and go forward in this. So we're going to talk about, to just give you guys a setting for what we're going to talk about for the rest of this hour, we would like to introduce basically 3 concepts that are direct prescriptions or solutions to those 3 problems. And then within those concepts, we're also going to talk about 8 principles that you can apply to start to bring strategy to life. How do you build more employee engagement into your programs? How do you overcome some of these obstacles that we know? And how ultimately can you design a change in your organization that's going to stick? That's going to be the goal of the rest of the hour. I'd like to introduce the first concept, which is something we call navigation system. It's something that should be very familiar to us. Going back to that drawing of getting from point A to point B, as humans, we are very accustomed to taking journeys. It's a metaphor that everyone universally understands. And navigating those far off destinations takes a number of components. We call these components a navigation system, and we'll unpack each of them individually. But the core concept is that together, this is a familiar way to help people understand where you need to go, how you're going to get there, and what the plan is. The first element of that navigation system is your mission or your purpose. People call this different things, but at the end of the day, there tends to be one true north for an organization of why they exist. Whether you call it your mission or your purpose, it's your reason for being. It's that thing that points the way to what's right and what's wrong and what you should be doing. And when in doubt, when we don't have a clear strategy or when circumstances change, it should be the compass that guides us in terms of where we need to go next. The next element that's really critical and that XPLANE is a huge believer in is creating a clear vision for the organization. A lot of people talk about what does vision mean? You know, is it this far off thing? Is it a short term? I think vision for me personally and for XPLANE and kind of what we've seen work successfully is the thing about picking a destination that is far enough out that you have to imagine it, but is achievable for the people that you're talking to. So whether that be 3 years, 5 years, 7 years from now, it's deciding where do you want to go, what is it going to look like when you open your eyes, and then painting that picture for people. It gives people something to aspire to, and it really paints that peak and makes very clear where do you want to go and how are you going to get there is the next question. That how you're going to get there is what we call strategy. A strategy is the route that you pick to get to that destination. The strategy gets you from point A to point B. There's lots of different ways that you can get there. Part of the art of strategy design, a lot of what I used to do as a strategy consultant and a lot of my peers on this call do, is actually designing for this organization what's the right best route to get from point A to point B. And that really forms the map. And that's a really critical starting point. But as you're already hopefully seeing from this conversation, it's only one element of the bigger picture that humans need to actually make the journey. That map needs to be broken down as a next step into a roadmap. And a roadmap is really just taking that journey and breaking it into smaller, digestible pieces. What are the segments? Where are we going to go first? Then where are we going to go next? Then where are we going to go next? We never finish a journey in a day, but we do want to understand what we're supposed to accomplish in this day. And so a roadmap accompanying a strategy is a very powerful tool to help organizations understand what their next step's going to be. And then finally, and probably most importantly, and something that is often lacking in an organization, is translating that roadmap into something we like to call a role map. And a role map is starting to translate to that individual in the organization what their role is in the journey. As we're taking journeys, if you think about any big trip with family, with friends, everyone may have a role. Somebody's role today might be to cook the meal. Somebody else's role might be to carry the pack. But everyone contributes holistically to the organism getting from point A to point B. And if you remember that first big issue that we highlighted around lack of line of sight, this is really one of the critical connection points of helping people understand, if I can see the vision and I can see the strategy and I can see the roadmap, what's my job in getting this forward so that all of us collectively get to where we need to go. We're going to start, we're going to take a pause for a second and actually just take a quick poll based on this content. I'd love to understand from this group, do a little bit of research, what are the elements that we've just talked about that are actively being used in your company today? For most, we probably don't see them all, but I'd love to just get a sense from folks of what are the most common elements and what are the ones that you're seeing in either the organization you work in or organizations you're consulting for that are commonly used. We'll take about a minute to do this, and then we'll take a look at what we see. Fascinating. Okay. Great. We've got about half the group is reported in. We're going to give it another 15 or 20 seconds. Okay. We've got about 80% have now voted, which is kind of my magic number. So Erica, why don't we go ahead and publish this? And let's share it out with folks. This is fascinating. It's not terribly surprising. It, to me, sort of expresses what we've seen historically, which is that in tops-down organizations, of this entire navigation system, we tend to start from the tops down. So we can see pretty actively that, you know, by and large, 70-some% of folks have a sense of their mission or purpose in their organization. Surprisingly large number of people who think that the vision for their organization is clear. This is clear. This is better than non-average than what we've seen, but still 55%. That's pretty good. 63% have a clear strategy. It seems like a large number, but then if you step back for a second, you're like, wow, only just a little more than half of our organizations even have clarified what their strategy is. And then look at what happens after that, that connective tissue that gets us to connecting the individual and the organization to the strategy, the vision, and the mission. Only 2% of folks have a clear understanding of what their role is in the bigger process. Even the roadmaps are only about a third. So you can start to see why that first challenge that we've highlighted is a real thing, which is, again, that idea of if we tell them what the big picture is, everyone will kind of snap to it. And that doesn't necessarily always happen. So thank you for sharing that content. Let's move on. So that concludes the sort of the first concept, which is a navigation system. It's something that if you take the data we just looked at and you think about your own organization, you can ask yourself the question, do we have all these elements? And can anyone in our organization find out and answer these questions? What is my role? What is my role in the roadmap overall? How does that roadmap ladder to the strategy? How does that get us to the vision? And is all of this aligned with our vision and our purpose? That's the critical question to ask. We're going to do one more poll before we hop into the second concept. We'd just like to know more empirically now, if you just back up and ask yourself, is it working? Do we have, in my company, are we aligned on this navigation system? And a lot of organizations, for instance, may have a vision, may have a purpose, and may have a strategy, and they're discordant. So just for you personally, in the organization that you spend the most time in, either as an employee, as an owner, as a consultant, do you feel that your company is aligned on these elements? And we got about 60% in. Interesting, okay. I don't think you guys will be surprised at the result. Just one more minute here. Okay, Erica, I think we can publish this. So not surprisingly, it's almost an 80-20 rule. 77% of folks do not feel that their navigation system is aligned. About 23% do, which is fantastic. And this group very much aligns with what we've seen sort of in the marketplace. If you go back to that first slide and we talked about the fact that 80% of strategies fail, this lines up pretty closely with that root cause analysis. So, and I see there was a question about whether we're going to be sharing this information out. Everybody on this call is going to get this information shared back with you. So we're happy to sort of put this back out to the world. So thanks for participating in this. So let's jump into our second core concept. This is meant to give us a roadmap to what strategy activation can look like and should look like. And we call it the activation curve. It's rooted in learning theory. It's rooted in understanding how humans actually learn information and change their behaviors. And what we know, if you think about the typical strategy rollout, we typically see the strategy being rolled out at a town hall, maybe sent out by email, maybe in a presentation. That only gets us up the first step of building awareness in strategy activation. The first phase of strategy activation is really around communicating the information and getting people to hear it. But not only hear it, they have to move to action. They have to move from hearing it to actually understanding it and accepting it and understanding this is a better route forward for them. So when we think about the hear it phase of strategy activation, we think about not only how do you communicate it to build awareness, that first step, but how do you help using empathy and design thinking tools understand the needs of their users, what they need to hear, what they need to learn, and what they're going to need to understand or have questions have answered to move to action, so that we can get them over that acceptance step. Only then, at the point of acceptance, are we going to see employees actually moving forward in alignment and actually activating the new strategy or the new behavior change. The second step of this process then is, after we've received that acceptance, the next step is we need to actually get people to start believing it and using these new behaviors and internalizing the fact that they're better than the way they used to do something. I like to talk about this as getting Bob to do something different on Monday morning. This person's been doing something consistently the same way for a long time. We've now asked them to change their behavior. They have to both understand why they need to change their behavior, and then they need to rehearse it and practice it. And that's how we learn typically. So in this phase, we think about how do we help them acquire the new skills? How do we help create opportunities for folks to apply those new skills, those new behaviors, those new techniques, those new processes? And then because of the feedback loops that happen, what's happening for them to now internalize those results, both individually and for the whole organization? This looks like learning at an individual level, at an organizational level. It looks a lot like sharing out and communicating about successes. Here's something that we tried that really worked well. Here's something that we tried that didn't work as well, but here's what we learned from it. So creating those feedback loops that help both individuals and the organization to internalize knowledge is a critical step. And then finally, if we get through those two phases, then we're in the phase where we're starting to live the change. This is where people have now integrated this into their ways of work. In a lot of ways, this starts to become the new way of work, the new business as usual. And that's when, as leaders of change, we know that we've actually reached the finish line. It's not when we've thrown the strategy over the wall, it's when that strategy is now the way we work every day. And when that happens, you're now at the point where you get to start the next curve and start looking into the future and thinking about how we improve things from there. So a quick poll, we find these useful to just kind of share out both for you and for us. We'd like to understand, on that activation curve that we just shared, where do you think your organization is at? If you were to plot yourself between awareness and looking into the future, where would you sit on this in your organization? Let's take one quick moment and put ourselves on this map. Okay, we're at about 60%. We'll wait till we get to another 10 votes or so. Okay. So let's go ahead and publish this. Yeah, this is interesting. If people have interesting reactions or surprises, go ahead and type them into the chat. I'm going to just observe a few things here that, just like that 80-20 rule we talked about, this is starting to play out as well, that we do a really good job at the top end of that curve. Well, and I'm not even sure 40% is a good job. So, 40% of the audience responded that we're sort of at the awareness phase. That is a little bit scary in the sense that we should all be well through that and up into the rest of them. Numerically, it fans out that we've got about, a big part of this group in the awareness phase, some are in the understanding phase, then it starts to really drop off at accepting and acquiring. And very few people are in that final phase of living it, where we've internalized the change we're making and we're integrating that and becoming business as usual. So again, it just emphasizes where we need to make that investment. And I think collectively, part of the conclusion is we need to make it across all three phases. If we want to get folks to this destination of new business as usual, we need to be thinking methodically about how we actually create interventions at each of these stages to get people along the route. So thank you for that. Let's talk about the last concept now. This is a rich meal. So we're going to talk a little bit about employee engagement. One of the folks in the chat earlier on was talking about those folks that are resistant, the folks that are sort of creating that blockage in the organization. And I think that's a big part of this employee engagement conversation. Whenever somebody launches a change into an organization, it could be anything. What we tend to see, again, it's an 80-20 rule. There's about 20% of the folks in the organization who are just wired to be enthusiastic for change. And it's a small number, by the way. Those folks are the ones that say, yeah, I can see why. Sure, let's do this. This is good for me. We're going to be better off. And they're right at the front of that change process. What we also see, maybe not as visibly, but they're there, are those 20% of folks, sorry, we're not moving, there we go. The 20% of folks that are resistant. Now, the problem with these 20% is that we don't see it as obviously. They're not going to advertise that they're in the no way space, but they're there. These are the folks that are asking themselves, why should I change? There's too much risk in it for me. And oftentimes management doesn't get it. They don't see what we're doing here on the ground. This is coming, another flavor of the month coming over the top. No way am I going to do this. I'm just going to sit back and let this happen. So now we already have 20% of the organization that are working against the strategy activation process. This is a problem, but I would suggest this isn't the biggest problem we have. Actually, the biggest problem is the group in the middle. The folks, the 60% that are sitting on the fence that are maybe publicly saying, sure, we're on board, but privately they're thinking, I'm going to wait this out and see. They might be saying no way, but this is the group that really has to be persuaded that this is a good idea. They need to understand what it is that we're doing. They need to understand what's in it for me, what's the benefit for me to change. And if they're all skeptical, they are most likely to be the ones that will sit back and say, this will pass. I'll just keep doing what I'm doing and sit back quietly until it happens. You can imagine with this circumstance that change is really challenging because that 20% of folks is not going to drag the other 80% forward. We have to get to these people in the middle. We have to help engage these employees that are in the 60% group, because if we can get half of them, we're well on the way to getting there. If we can get all of them, we're going to be in that 20% that succeeds. But it is a real dynamic in organizations. So we'd like to introduce a set of principles here to talk about how to overcome this employee engagement challenge. We've all come from a background of traditional hierarchical change management. When I was in business school, I studied with John Kotter's school of thought, but there's a lot of other change management methodologies out there. But if you look at the words that we use, change management itself feels very much like a top-down kind of approach, forcing stakeholder buy-in, cascading the plans, driving adoption. These are not wrong words for the time, but they are definitely they're representative of a different time of organizational design, one that was really driven by hierarchical organizations that really did have more of a command and control structure. And what we know right now is that that's not the way most of our organizations are wired anymore. They still exist, but let's look at organizations like some of the largest organizations in the world, like Google, who really have a very empowered workforce, a lot of distributed workers, a lot of remote workers, a lot of folks that have a lot of autonomy, both in their job as well as in their ability to execute and make decisions. And so we would posit that the old way of engaging employees and driving change isn't going to work. In fact, we should change that language completely and start talking about new ways of activating employees. We want to be thinking about, how do we activate our vision? How do we engage the stakeholders in the process? How do we get authentic participation so that people feel like they're a part of it? We'll talk a little bit about co-creation as a powerful tool to get people on board and engaged in becoming owners of the change. We want to be building on the bright spots and celebrating those successes when we do see people internalizing behaviors and seeing them work, so that that enthusiasm spreads in the organization actively. And lastly, we feel very much that the change process now and employee engagement now has got to be built not from a process, but from a set of principles. So designing from principles is the last sort of key concept that we're going to share today. We've identified that there's a number of principles, but there's really 8 that are core to what we've seen work with organizations that are good at this. And these are all principles that can be adapted to your organization in a different fuel mixture based on who your organization is. We talked in the last slide about authentic participation. One size does not fit all anymore. Every organization is completely unique and different. And so these principles really need to be considered as what's authentic to my organization, where can I apply more pressure or less pressure, or more inspiration or less inspiration on these to actually move my organization in its current state forward. And hopefully this will give you a toolkit in terms of ways to think about designing any change or transformation or strategy activation that's going to resonate in your organization but make a bigger impact than if you were to use the old way and just cascade it down. So let's dive into that. The first one that we want to sort of identify is, I think, one of the most powerful things that we found at XPLANE, which is the concept of co-creation. The very idea of throwing something over the wall is very familiar to a lot of us, but throwing over the wall doesn't really work anymore when you have empowered, mindful, intelligent workforce who is more entrepreneurial, is more engaged, and really needs to be involved in the process of change. And more importantly, even than that, probably has a lot of the answers that we as leaders don't about what's working and what's not working on the ground. So the idea of co-creation is the idea of how do we engage these people in the process of creating the strategy? How do we engage them in the process of deploying it? How do we engage them in the process of putting the specific tactics or the specific work streams or initiative into it so that we're doing the right stuff? And if we can co-create this with people, we know that people tend to support that which they've been involved in. So if you can get people's fingerprints on the process of the activation plan, for instance, how does this impact your role map? How do we get you involved in the actual delivery of this new technique? How do we start to build these behaviors? If they're involved in the process of creating that for them and they and their teams, they're much more likely to be advocates and supporters of this because they're going to see their fingerprints on the blueprints. So co-creation is sort of a key element that we speak to quite a bit. The second one is activation, investing in activation, and we talk about the activation roadmap. Going back to that second concept of just not even thinking about this, we need to actually have a plan about how we're going to bring people along from awareness to the point where they've accepted, internalized, and made this the new way of business. And so we think about investing in activation in terms of both what is that journey and what is that journey and how is it different for each of the stakeholders? The executive in the room who is maybe involved in the strategy probably is already well up the activation curve because they've authored a lot of it. However, the folks on the ground or your customers or the folks that are individual contributors further out in the field, this is new to them. So we need to be thinking about both investing in activation and how do we pace out and distribute this information, these tools, these technologies to the right people at the right time to match where they are in the learning curve. And that's a sort of a critical step in thinking about any change plan. And we can share some tools about how to do that. The third one is around building empathy with key stakeholders. So getting again to that idea of what's in it for me seems obvious, but we aren't really great at doing this. Whether we bring from design principles, things like empathy maps, whether we go out and actually just do listening journeys with the various stakeholders in the group, even taking the action of understanding who are the stakeholders in a major change, and then what do we need them to do and what are the key questions we need to answer for them is critical to understanding not only what we need to communicate, but what tools and job aids and supports we need to invest in to help them be successful. So empathy, like it fits clearly in design thinking, fits very much in strategy activation as well. Visualization of the navigation system is the fourth principle that we'd like to introduce. XPLANE has been in the business of visual communications for 25 years, and we believe in it because we know it works. At the end of the day, if you can't draw a picture of where you want to go, whether it be a map on a napkin or a picture of your strategy, it's going to be really hard to communicate it. Probably one, it hasn't been very well thought out. And secondly, you're not going to be able to make it clear to others as efficiently with words as you can with visuals. So we encourage everyone that we work with to find not only a way to visualize your vision, your strategy, your roadmap, but make it so clear that you can point at it somewhere. If you look at some of the case studies with some of our clients, many of them, when they're finished with their strategic planning process, actually create a wall mural of that vision and that strategy, and they put it up in sort of visible places around their organization, so that every single day, people can engage with it, can point at it, can talk at it, can look at it, and can exchange ideas about it, and it becomes a living element of their activation system. So we encourage you to think about navigation systems being visualized, put them in the places that make sense. The fifth concept is to systemize the linkages. And what I mean by this is, if your vision doesn't tie to your strategy, and if your strategy, for instance, doesn't tie to your budget, and your roles don't tie to your strategy, it's not going to work. So none of these things are an island. We need to think of them as a system. Borrowing from design thinking and system design, look across the elements of your system and make sure that they're aligned. If we set out a bold strategy, but we don't support that with the resources and the budget to deliver against that, we're going to build frustration and resentment amongst our employees. Likewise, if an employee doesn't see how their role design attaches to that vision, they're probably not going to be very successful in their role, nor are they going to be a happy contributor to your organization. So think about how to systematize the linkages, use it as both a check in your organization about, are we doing the right stuff, and also make it clear to people. And again, best practice is to visualize this as much as you can. In this example that we have on the screen, does your vision, your mission, your strategy, and the dashboard that you're measuring those things all align, so that people are seeing that, oh yes, we're measuring the things that we want to have as outcomes. On the engagement of employees, these are all principles for engagement, but one thing that we have learned in the engagement business is that there's no reason that we can't make it fun. There's no reason that we can't make it different. There's no reason that we can't make learning more engaging. So we encourage you to look for ways to engage employees in ways that break the norms, not just a present to, but an interactive experience. We use games a lot. Gamification is pretty powerful for a bunch of reasons, but if you guys are game players, if any of you are game players, you know that it's an opportunity to take a set of principles, apply them and rehearse them in a fun environment, and learn while you're doing it. On the screen, we're showing an example of a game that we created for a company to roll out their corporate strategy worldwide. And what was interesting was, it wasn't a PowerPoint presentation to throw the strategy out and say, these are our principles or our strategies. It was actually a game where they had to quickly learn the strategy and then apply it in the game. And it wasn't even about learning the strategy anymore. They were jumping right into, if I apply this strategy, I'll probably be more successful in this game. If I don't, I'll probably lose. And the ability to rehearse it in a risk-free environment was both fun, interactive, and we know from learning theory, actually got them up that learning curve very quickly. They heard the information, they applied it, they got feedback very quickly, and they internalized it and moved to action. So look for the opportunities as you engage employees to make it fun, to start to use learning theory to help people both see, hear, understand, touch, interact. And the more of that you do, the more successful it's going to be. The seventh principle that we'd like to introduce you to is the idea of embedding it in your organizational DNA. You've got a lot of things that are already working in your organization. You've probably got break rooms where you've got communications. Maybe there's video monitors that are sharing information. Maybe you already have an internal newsletter or an intranet. Maybe you have some rituals in your organization where people come together on a regular pace. Find those opportunities and embed your strategy activation into it. What are the ways to actually use the mechanisms that already exist, but make sure that everywhere that folks are, the message is, the tools are. Find the ways to do this creatively. Again, some of our best clients have used visualization to make this a very real thing in all of their organization across all offices. To the extent that you can actually share the message consistently over time in many different ways, the organization is going to come along more quickly. So the key to this is keep communicating, and communicate everywhere where people are already interacting. And then lastly, the last principle of the day before we're going to move on to some Q&A, we have to recognize that change is not only a constant, it's constantly increasing in pace. And so the day of building the 3-year strategy and putting it a binder is dead, very simply. We can't design strategies that aren't adaptive to fast changing circumstances. So we encourage you to think about, how do you make everything that you're doing agile? How do you create the feedback loops that allow us to take that first step on the roadmap, understand from the participants what worked, what didn't work, and how to get to that next step. And then if need be, course correct as you go down to the next step in the roadmap. This can take a lot of forms, but at the highest level, it I think hits at that roadmap level of understanding, if this is our strategy to get from point A to point B, where are we going to build in the checkpoints along the roadmap to get the feedback from the people that are involved in it, understand what's working and what's not working, and then make the corrections and learn from those experiences so that we can continue to navigate to that summit, even if we have to course correct on the way. This is something that can take it's both a principle, and it can also be actually visualized in the organization. We see a lot of organizations that are taking their 3 or 4 top themes of their strategy for the next 3 years, translating that into individual tactics and work streams that have to happen, but then tracking them on a quarterly basis and putting those evaluation steps to move to the next place. At the end of the day, that agility is going to do a couple of things for you. One is it's going to reflect the reality of how strategy works today. 2 is it's an enormous opportunity to engage employees, to have your employees constantly sharing feedback on what they're feeling, what's successful, what's not successful, and contributing to the change process. So this principle works at a lot of different layers. And I think it's one that's really critical in keeping the organization engaged in the process and aligned as you move through the journey. So to wrap up and conclude kind of what we've been talking about today, there are 3 things that we see that are really challenges or barriers to becoming part of those people that execute strategy successfully. One of them is solving the line of sight problem. How do you get employees to see the same summit, the same route to get there, and make it relevant to their day jobs? And this is where we recommend that you employ the concept of aligning your navigation system. Make sure that your vision, your strategy, your mission, your role map, and your roadmaps are all aligned so that everyone sees that clear line of sight. The second challenge that we addressed was that failure to invest in activation. This one can be solved with an activation plan. Start thinking about strategy not as the end point of delivery, but the beginning of the journey that goes from the point of having the strategy to bringing that strategy to life. And think about how to attach that to the way that humans learn and how they need to hear it, believe it, and move to action, and invest in building a plan that goes beyond the launch of the strategy all the way to the realization of the strategy. And then finally, as you're taking this journey, overcome that lack of employee engagement problem by starting to pick and choose from these menu of 8 principles of employee engagement in a way that's authentic to your organization, and put them to use and see what happens. It's pretty magical when you can start to find ways to get the people in your organization involved in the execution of the strategy. They bring great ideas to the table. They put their fingerprints on the solutions. And collectively, we like to say that the smartest person in the room is the room. So collectively, you as an organization are going to be more successful if everyone's fingerprints are on the process throughout the process and throughout the journey. We're going to take a few minutes for questions, but for those of you that are needing to drop off, we want to just set the table in terms of some next opportunities. We are going to do, this was largely theoretical conversation around what we've learned and what we've seen as best practices in the world. In February of the 7th, we're going to have a much more hands-on tools and techniques webinar. So I'd encourage all of you to put it on your calendar. On this one, what we'd like to do is actually share some tools that build on this knowledge and give you some templates and tools, some techniques that you can actually apply today, tomorrow in your work to actually bring this to life. In the interim between now and then, if you want to start accessing some of the technologies that we've made available, we encourage you to both visit our website at www.XPLANE, or we specifically have a tools page the URLs here on the screen, where you can actually download some templates, some canvases, some suggested exercises, including things like the activation plan, including some of the empathy maps that we use, that you can take away and go ahead and start using in your organization. We'd love to share these with you. And then we'd love to have any additional thoughts or feedback from you. You guys are all in the field doing this work. We hugely value the research and the knowledge that you share with us and the feedback that you give us on these tools. So we'd love to make this an ongoing dialogue and exchange. With that, I think we have a few minutes for Q&A. If you have questions that you would like to address, if you could go ahead and type them into the chat. We'll take 3 or 4 of these, and then we'll move on to next steps. So Brad says, in our organization, we seem to have different teams at different stages in the activation curve. Curious if you have thoughts or suggestions. Yes, absolutely. That is honestly one of the biggest kind of hidden realities of change activation, is the fact that a lot of organizations, even if they're enlightened to the idea that we need to bring people through this curve, don't understand that everyone comes through that curve, the activation curve, at different paces. So the key there, if you look at that activation map, is understanding who are the various stakeholders in this process, who are the top 5 or 6 groups that need to kind of move along, and mapping out where are they at today and customizing their journey for how do we get them to where they go tomorrow. It's really interesting to see when you see that organization, particularly that maybe still uses hierarchy, how they still are very reliant on the cascade. So we both want to align with the journey and bring people along as they go. The other thing I would add, Brad, that we have seen be very successful is also looking for kind of a secret trick in the process, which is creating ambassadors. We also want to start to encourage change to happen from within. So to avoid that cascading problem, we encourage companies to identify in a major change initiative who are the 5, 10, 15, 20, depending on your organization, maybe 50 or 100 folks, who are in that 20% that are already enthusiastic or maybe were involved in the process, but are also not necessarily in the hierarchy leaders, but are leaders among their peers. And these are folks that can be really activated as ambassadors if you can give them the tools to go out in the field among their peers and help support and promote the change activation. You can build a change process that happens from both below as well as from above, and collectively starts to represent the way the new organizations work. So thank you for that. Rebecca wants to know if we can speak more about the role map. What does that look like? How do you create that? Every organization has a version of this already, most of us, in what we call job descriptions. Unfortunately, job descriptions are kind of an outdated concept where oftentimes they're made and then they're put on the shelf. We encourage people to take what's already authentic in your organization, whether it's a job description, whether it's your annual goals process, maybe it's your review process. Find those things that are already the touch points that most organizations have to communicate with the employee what's expected of them and what the organization is going to give to them, because it is a two-way street, and start to make that your role map. The role map is a concept. It's a concept of making sure that I understand very clearly what my contribution is to the greater good of the collective organization. So if you can tailor your job description on an annual basis, if you can tailor your annual goals or your quarterly goals on a basis, or if you want to create something that's completely unique. With some organizations, we have literally taken the strategy down to a roadmap and then taken that roadmap down to the role maps of how the teams map into that and where they play in the roadmap. Those things in combination are best, but I would encourage you to start with what you're already using and align it with your overall roadmap for where you're going. Let's see. So a lot of questions coming in. I'm going to take this one from Luisa. How do we push the vision from employees towards the management? This is a really interesting emerging trend, I think. If we think of the old way, where a lot of times vision would come from the C-suite or would come from the board of directors and then get pushed down the organization. We're recognizing and talking a lot about how that misses so much. It misses so much visibility into the great ideas that bubble up. So one thing, if you're in a position to influence this, is to talk to leadership about, in the next strategic planning process, how do you create some listening posts in the organization that inform your strategic planning process? These can take this can go anywhere from having a company-wide visioning process to simply a bunch of lunch and learns or a bunch of brown bags, where the folks that are involved in the strategy process actually go out and seek feedback from the organization about what ideas they have, what have they seen, what's happening in their marketplace, what's happening with their customers, what are the things that should inform the strategy process and the vision process, and creating those listening posts, even if the organization isn't yet ready to really engage the whole organization in making the vision, at least take advantage of the ideas that are in the room to inform the strategic planning process. So I'd be happy to talk offline about lots of ideas to do that, but the key concept there is, what are those listening posts from your key stakeholders that can help make your vision better when you get around to visioning and strategy for the future? So with that, I'd like to thank everyone. There are a bunch of other questions here, and I would love to address many of them. Please feel free to reach out to me directly. I'm available and reachable through the website. Also, Erica and the team here are going to be pushing out a lot of the content that we've shared today to folks. And I do encourage people to go check out the tools page. We have put a lot of these things out there for you to use, because fundamentally we're all in the business of trying to create change in the world, and we want to encourage folks to be change makers with tools that are really tried and tested in the world. Lastly, I just want to thank all of you for making an hour of your day available to us. It was really a pleasure for me to share with you and to learn from you, and we hope to see you at the next webinar. So thanks very much. Have a great weekend all.